Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to play the modern Benoni with black, beginning with d4, knight f6, c4, c5, and we're going to be taking a look at how to play against something called the New York variation. Anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So it is, of course, possible to play, instead of the modern Benoni move order, you can play the Benoni from the King's Indian move order. You can play g6, and you can basically just get castled before you decide to play something like d6 and c5. This actually avoids the Taimanov, and it also avoids the New York variation, if you want it to, as a matter of fact, because it gives you the opportunity to only play the Benoni against setups that you're not terribly worried about. So the Taimanov variation isn't possible anymore because, of course, they can't throw in bishop b5 check because your king is no longer on e8, and the New York variation can, of course, be avoided as well because presumably against knight f3, you're going to be playing, the mainline King's Indian defense. So you can switch gears in those cases. But when you go at it from the modern Benoni move order with c5, d5, and you play e6, you can't really avoid anything. You have to be willing to play against the Taimanov variation and other sharp variations as well, like the McInnes and like the New York variation. So if you play this move order beginning with e6 and they play knight c3, if you want to, you still have the option to avoid the Taimanov. Now, it doesn't avoid some other sharp lines, but you can avoid the Taimanov variation. If you want to, you can play this move pawn to g6. And playing the move pawn to g6 is sort of a clever way to avoid the Taimanov variation. And if you're not familiar with it, the Taimanov variation happens after e d5, c d5, d6, e4, and then bishop g7. And your king isn't castled yet, so they can throw in this move bishop b5 check. And at this point, according to the engine and according to theory, white should have a major advantage. Even though it's not clear that it's enough to win, black should probably be okay here, and it's still a playable position for black if you want to play it. But it's understandable if you don't want to give your opponent a major advantage after just 8 moves and then just, kind of walk on a tightrope and try to survive. So the alternative to that is to play something like g6. And of course, the idea here is we don't want to capture on d5 until we're already kind of castled, or until we're out of the way of this possible check. So when we play g6 and they play e4, they're now threatening to play e5 and d6, so now we have to throw in the move pawn to d6. And now if they continue with a move like f4 and try to play the Taimanov variation, if we play the move bishop to g7, we don't have to worry about this move bishop b5 check because, of course, this bishop cannot move through this pawn because that would, of course, violate the rules of chess. So because we haven't captured on d5 yet, we don't have to worry about bishop takes bishop to b5 check. So we can get away with this particular move order, and then after something like knight f3, we could play e d5, c d5, and now they're finally threatening to play bishop b5 check, but we're getting out of the center in time. And this position is, according to the engine and according to theory, just should be completely equal, maybe even slight edge black, because there just isn't this check, and black doesn't have any real problems. So why doesn't everybody just play this move order? Well, there are other things that you have to worry about when you play this move order. One of them is called the New York variation. After e4, you can play d6, and then they can play the move knight f3. You can play bishop to g7, and then they can play this move pawn to h3. Now, h3 is a really useful move. It doesn't look like it to beginners. Beginners look at a move like h3 and they think this move looks really ridiculous. It looks really silly. But of course, the point is that black wants to play e takes d5, and most human players don't want to play the computer's favorite move, which is to capture symmetrically, because after castles, they're concerned that these positions, even though white should have an advantage because of the weakness on d6, they're concerned that the positions have a very drawish nature because of the symmetrical pawn structure. And they do. Black actually has a pretty clear path to equality. He just needs to develop his last couple of pieces and equalize. Actually, there was a game, I've got this game, Liesel versus Hagboyan, played on chess.com just recently in 2024. And these are both 2,500 plus players. Continued bishop e2, bishop f5. And then we had knight h4, and then knight e4 just kind of equalized on the spot. And actually, black eventually went on to win. But basically, black just got a bunch of pieces off the board, and he's already equal. Black had a better move here. Black had knight takes d5, and at least according to the engine, this is slight edge black. So knight takes d5 was also a possibility, and that would have been slight edge black. So getting to equality from these symmetrical pawn structures hasn't been a terribly difficult task for black historically, and especially just amongst humans. When people play people and people make minute mistakes, as opposed to computers playing computers. But most people like to play this move c takes d5, and this is where the move h3 kind of shines. The whole point is just to disallow this bishop any logical place to develop. We can't play it to f5, we can't play it to g4. This means that black is going to have this logjam on the back rank in the Benoni, and that's a little bit frustrating. So that brings us to the New York variation. We have castles, and then we have bishop to d3. Now, I personally, at a certain point in my chess career, I tried to avoid playing against the New York variation. And this is just a personal preference that I had because I had some bad experiences in the New York variation that were just kind of personal. It's nothing to say that black can't get a good game from here. Black should be okay. The positions are objectively all slight edge white, but beyond that, the assessments are better than most of the assessments that you get out of something like the Taimanov variation. So, on the whole, like this should be not only very playable, it should be sort of desirable. Like black should be aiming for stuff like this. But the main move here is b5. And this is where I always had difficulties, just always had difficulties. And I can't explain why. But in practical games, I never managed to get this completely right. Is you play b5, and then almost all of my opponents would take this pawn with either the bishop or the knight. I very rarely had anybody that just left it there, although it is theoretical. Like, you can just leave it there. I have a high-level game. I have Mamanjarov versus Karyana, where Mamanjarov just left it there. Although, Karyana just continued with b4, and Karyana, of course, did very good with black. I mean, everything was fine, actually. Karyana went on to win that game. That was Mamanjarov versus Karyana, played in Paris, France, back in 2019. But needless to say, usually in the Benoni, if you can play b5, b4, and you can expand, typically you're okay. Typically black's okay. Typically black's at least equal. But most of my opponents would take with either the bishop or the knight, and this is where I would always mix things up. If they take with the bishop, you're supposed to play knight captures e4. This is the theoretical move that equalizes, and it leads to this long forcing continuation. Knight e4, knight e4, queen a5 check, knight fd2, queen takes b5, knight d6, queen a6, knight on 2 to c4, knight d7, castles, knight e5 is supposed to be relatively equal or close to equality for black. And then, of course, the other line that they can play is they can play knight takes b5, and in which case you're supposed to play rook e8. Now, for whatever reason, I would always mix them up. I always knew that you were supposed to play rook e8 against one and knight b5 against the other. And I know it's supposed to be, I mean, I know you're screaming at your screens, Rob, it's obvious. If they play bishop b5, you can't play rook e8 because there's a bishop attacking the 8 square. And certainly against bishop takes b5, I would normally find knight takes e4. The problem is I would also play knight takes e4 against knight takes b5 because I couldn't remember why I couldn't play it. So I kept getting into trouble repeatedly in the positions where my opponents would play knight takes b5 because for whatever reason I kept thinking knight takes e4 was a playable move. And just for reference, it's really not. Knight takes e4 is just a question mark move, and I'm going to show one of my own games here. I'm going to show a game where I lost terribly. This was Darwin Yang, who's a grandmaster now. At the time, he wasn't. Darwin Yang versus Robert Plunkett. And at the time this game was played, I was the higher rated player, by the way. I was rated higher than Darwin. I know Darwin Yang is a GM now, and he's very, very good. And he was a young phenom at the time, and I think one of the more annoying things about this game is how quickly he played. He blitzed everything out because I guess basically I fell into a theory trap and I just didn't know the theory. And he just knew all of it. Like he just looked at it at home. There was zero thought. There was no calculation at all. And he just crushed me. But it went bishop to e4 and then I played rook e8 and then knight g5. This was his idea. And this is quite frankly just the idea that I missed is I played h6 thinking, okay, fine, what are you going to do? I play h6, I'm threatening your bishop, I'm threatening your knight, what are you going to do? And then just instantaneously knight e6. Because, of course, this is the refutation. I cannot play f captures e6 because this bishop will be attacking this rook at the end of everything. This position is just not simple. And the engine backs this up too. The engine basically just says that this position is already somewhere between major to decisive advantage white. Although I played actually relatively accurately from here. I just lost. So like I played queen a5 check, knight c3, bishop c3, bc3, queen c3, bishop d2, queen c4. Like I'm giving this a college try. Queen e2 takes, and then I finally took takes, and then I guess the computer gives me slightly better chances with rook e6. I played bishop e6 and then sacked the exchange this way, thinking that this would give me some chances because, of course, I have some counterplay with, bishop g2, d5, c4, but, all my pieces are in the back rank and all I had to do was get active. And, for young players, for these young phenoms, finding a handful of active moves in a row really isn't all that hard. After rook he1, I didn't have anything really better than this, and now it's just two undeveloped pieces versus two developed pieces. If I at least had a little bit of activity, I'd have more of a chance. And I tried to make stuff happen, but it's just really hopeless. I mean, I'm trying to be tricky, but he wasn't going to fall for anything, and it was just at a certain point, it's just sad. The game went on for a few more moves, but the result wasn't in question, and Darwin Yang won that game fairly easily. So after knight takes b5, just the short answer is do not play knight takes e4. The correct move is just rook e8, and then this should lead to equality. Rook e8 castles, knight e4, bishop e4, or actually, I mean, it should lead to slight edge white if everything's played perfectly. But it tends to lead to equality even in high-level games. Like after rook takes e4, knight g5, rook b4, we're actually following Van Weely versus Topalov, and Topalov sort of was somewhere between equal and maybe even slight edge black already. And Topalov eventually went on to win with the black pieces. So that's essentially how you're supposed to play against the New York variation. You're supposed to play b5, and this is supposed to be okay. You're supposed to be in good shape here. Like b5, you're supposed to be good against a3. b4 is supposed to be fine for black. And on either bishop takes b5, knight takes e4, this is supposed to be okay for black. And of course, knight takes b5. And the move I always forget to play, rook e8, you're supposed to be okay for black. Now, if you're like me and you don't want to play against this just because you cannot, for whatever reason, remember to play rook e8 against knight b5, then go ahead and avoid it. I mean, it's very avoidable. You can play it from the King's Indian defense move order, and if you play from that move order, you can avoid any defense where you don't want to play the Benoni against that particular setup. But of course, this is a very reasonable system to play with black, and it's another argument to play the Benoni from the modern Benoni move order because if you're not afraid of playing against the Taimanov variation, then you shouldn't be afraid of playing against this so-called New York variation because, at least according to the engine, black is supposed to be somewhere just between very slightly worse and equality, which of course is a better assessment than what you would get out of something like the Taimanov. So anyways, hope you enjoyed this content. Hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games, and thank you very much for watching.